And so my first response was, but why are we doing all of this manually? Literally printing out PDFs of invoices for signature, putting it in an inter-office mail envelope and sending it across the ocean to get paid.
Wow.
Like literally. And then just hoping it gets paid. No visibility of when it would be. Or
it was like a mailroom. That's amazing, actually, in a sense.
Literally. And I knew that there was tech that could do this, even from my experience in the restaurant industry.
Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows, to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at SpotDraft.com.
How can training to be a professional opera singer translate to the legal operations profession? How do you build a career in legal ops without any formal training? And what role should technology play, if any, in a strong legal ops program? Today on The Abstract, I am joined by Cory Clines, one of the most interesting guests I think we've had to date. Cory was trained as a classical opera singer at conservatories in upstate New York and Boston, and he had a first career in fine dining and as a sommelier to support himself between gigs. Upon moving to New York City, he stumbled into legal operations, first at Lloyd's, the big insurer marketplace, which folks have probably heard of, and then as a consultant and at the law firm that serviced Condé Nast. Most recently, he's been at the Campari Group. He has about 15 years of experience building legal ops programs across all of these sort of huge institutions, brand names. Cory, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm very glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Everybody, I think, knows Campari as the maker of, well, Campari and Aperol and all of these cool alcoholic beverages. Let's start off light, not talking about legal ops.
Okay.
What's your go-to cocktail?
Oh, good question. For a long time, it was a Campari soda in the summer, and I'm not just jilling on behalf of my company here, and old fashions in the winter. But over the last few years, I've really switched over to margaritas and tequila-based cocktails. I love a Campari or a Grand Marnier margarita in particular. It's very tasty. Campari is a big player. They've got a lot of different brands that I didn't even know about when they started. So it's been good to learn about those, and the cocktails are great. We'll leave it at that.
What's a good Campari brand tequila? I mean, is Grand Marnier also a Campari spirit?
It is. Yep. Tequila Espolón is our biggest one right now, and then there are a couple of more craft ones like Mayenda is really great. Cabo Wabo is on the high end, and then they're doing a lot in the mezcal area. So a lot of agave-based spirits. It's a big growth area. Yeah.
Very cool. I'm sure that the company, happy hours and parties are fun.
Yes, they're not. There are plenty of them. We'll just put it that way.
That's great. Okay, so you trained as an opera singer, which I've got to ask you about, because first of all, I don't know if I'd ever met an opera singer before, and certainly not someone who also has a profession in the legal space who trained as an opera singer. When did you discover that as a passion? And I'm also curious, what are some of the best performances that you've had the opportunity to give before?
Thanks. Great question. I didn't discover opera until undergrad, about halfway through my undergrad degree. It wasn't something I was aware of growing up, really. There was country was much more the predominant music. But I was musical, have a musical family. So I grew up playing the cello. And I started singing in junior year of high school, towards the end of high school. And when I got to college, I was singing in the big choir just for fun. And then I think second semester, I was drafted into singing in the chorus at the conservatory, which is the Eastman School of Music. And I say drafted because it literally it's like, hey, you have low notes, come sing with us because we need your low notes. And that kind of was like the beginning of the end for me. Like I got hooked, we'll put it that way. Even though it's a kind of a foreign art form, well, it is literally foreign, but also unusual in the US, opera. But it's really rewarding. It takes a lot of studying. There's a lot of language involved. So it really just got my curiosity. And I was like, oh, I can get paid to do this, and I like doing it. So that's kind of how I got there. And favorite performances, I would say like solo performances. I've done Mozart's Figaro in 2018. That was a big accomplishment. That's a really hard role and very, very rewarding. More recently, because I do have a corporate job, I've just been doing a few things. But last year I got to sing with New York City Opera Chorus at Carnegie Hall, which was pretty cool.
Absolutely.
So there's, other than that, those are some highlights. Candide is one of my favorite kind of opera / musicals. I think I've done that show more than any other, by Leonard Bernstein. And so, yeah, that's some highlights, but I've done a lot. We'll put it that way.
That's amazing.
I would be remiss if I did not say that Gaston and Beauty and the Beast, even though not opera, is also one of my favorite roles because that's just super fun.
Do you have to learn like Italian and Latin to succeed?
Yeah, we do diction classes, as they call it, and language classes, where we'll spend a semester on Italian and a semester on French, German. Latin kind of comes with Italian. But yeah, we do have to study. There was a time when I could converse in Italian, but not anymore. If I were to go to Italy, I'm sure I could get it back. But yeah, we have to learn all of the Romance languages. And every once in a while, you have to sing something in Russian or in Hebrew or Yiddish, or like you never really know what the gig is.
Okay, that's amazing. So you pick this up in sophomore year of college. Do you have to now learn all of these languages?
Yes, and that was very much a surprise. I was like, oh, okay. There are a lot of programs where you can go and immerse yourself and go like study in Italy and learn it. That wasn't really an option for me, so I had to do it the hard way, just taking classes. And they do offer diction classes at conservatory where you come and you learn how to say things, but that doesn't mean you understand it. So that's the other part of it, is you have to combine that language skill of being able to say the words with what am I actually talking about in this moment, or singing about, as it may be. And it's just really, so without knowing the language intimately and speaking it fluently, you kind of have to make up your own subtext, right? Like you have to make up like this is what I'm singing about, and this is why it's important for me as this person singing this character to sing it. But yes, we have to know Italian, French, German, Latin for if you're doing a church gig. Every once in a while, some other languages like Russian, or I sang in Yiddish last year. And then there's a Spanish variant of our opera called Zarzuela. So you never really know what the gig will have until you get the gig.
So legal operations must be really easy for you, because that sounds, I mean, I took Latin in middle school, high school, and a little bit in college as well. And I exited those, 8 cumulative years with probably like barely proficiency in being able to write, let alone being able to speak. Certainly not able to sing. That's amazing.
It comes in handy mostly just when it's nice to be able to surprise people with a phrase, even if I can't carry on a conversation, just like to say thank you in a different language. But yeah, it is definitely a different part of the brain. I wouldn't say it's made legal ops easy, but it has been beneficial for sure.
Are there any skills that you picked up, things that you learned as you were getting good at opera or training around opera, that you feel like have overlap with, or that you apply today in the legal ops work that you do? Absolutely.
Kind of at the meta level, the biggest level, I think the two things that really translate the best are collaboration and discipline. And I'll talk about collaboration first, in that you literally can't make opera alone. It's impossible.
Yeah.
There are dozens, if not hundreds, of people behind the scenes and in the cast and in the orchestra. And you really need all of those people to be working together to make a performance happen. Similarly, legal operations can't work in a vacuum. You have to involve those other business functions and collaborate to reach a common goal. So I've even pitched this at Campari, like this is kind of how we translate it. It's like, okay, we're putting on the legal transformation show, right? We're on the stage, but we need to rely on finance. We need to rely on IT. We need to rely on the whole global legal team. It's just an analogy, but it really does work. It gets people to be like, oh, right. Like, I'm not just doing my job. We have to kind of all work together to make these big changes happen. And then with discipline, it's a tricky word, and it's also trickier to make it happen. In music, everyone must follow the same time signature and be in the same key. If they're not, then you just hear chaos. So that's the discipline in music, is like you have to do what's written on the page. In a corporate setting, changing those ways of working is hard, especially when there's new technology. So you have to get people on board and willing to embrace the change. So getting everybody basically reading the same music, right? Instead of saying, well, but I like this piece of music and I like this piece of music. It's like, no, we're all following the same piece of music now. Because if you try to force that on them, it won't be successful. But there also have to be consequences. So that's kind of the flip side. It's like, it's getting buy-in, but when somebody says, oh, I'm just not going to do that, that's when you go to your GC and say, okay, so what are the consequences? If everyone isn't following the same rules, then you won't get the desired results. So yeah, that's kind of at the highest point, is like collaboration and discipline. It's really important.
I love that idea of describing it as a show. I've often talked about, I'm very passionate about the idea that internal communication matters a lot, and presenting your wins internally matters a lot, and thinking about how you roll out policies or roll out process matters. All that matters just as much as whether or not you reached the right decision or decided on the right process or the policy is perfect. I love this idea that it's a show.
Yeah. It's the optics. It's like you're literally changing the face of legal at the organization. So it is a show. You have to change the way you look to the people that you're working with and get them to embrace that.
We're going to talk a lot about today, some of the best practices and things that you've learned over the course of your career. But I want to take a step back to when you were transitioning from opera and working in restaurants and wine to legal ops. In your first job, which was at Lloyd's, it actually wasn't in legal ops. It was as a temp, which turned into an EA job for the GC. And that to me is really interesting because, going from a temp to EA and then ultimately sort of scaling into legal ops means that you really earned the trust of that general counsel. Talk to me a little bit about some of the lessons that you learned there about how you go about building trust with a GC.
Sure. At Lloyd's, it was a great learning experience, and the role really grew very quickly. And it was because I did have the GC's trust. I was his Guy Friday. Whatever he needed, I would try and find a solution. And that's very common for a lot of executive assistants, right? They're there to support the GC. But then it started to go beyond that. He's like, okay, you're great at helping me with everything I need, but the organization needs some more help. And I think that you could handle this. And so, kind of dipping my toe into that was project management and restructuring of their files. Their digital files were just a mess. And I didn't do anything magic. It was literally just like, okay, well, let's just set these up so they work, so everybody can find what they're looking for. And this was before DMs were in place in-house, and nobody was talking about document management really for in-house teams. So, and just general organizational help for the legal team. And I think that same paradigm is really useful for all legal ops and GC relationships. It's be willing to listen and address their needs so that they look good. And those needs will change throughout your relationship. But it's just like, okay, I'm willing, I'm here to help. Let's make some positive change. And the biggest thing I would say is make sure that you and the GC share the same vision, that legal ops and the GC are completely aligned.
Sure.
Because if you don't, then it's not likely to be a successful relationship. Again, to that, my point about consequences, that you have some flexibility with other lawyers on the team where you can there can be some push or some ebb and flow and little pushback. But if you're GC and you just don't agree, then it's not going to be successful. So either you have to come around to there, way of thinking, or convince them to come to yours. Either way.
Right. What did you find worked when you were trying to make a case with a GC? Is it data? Is it understanding where the business is headed and making a sort of business case? What are the different sort of arrows you have in your quiver when you're trying to make a case for something to a GC?
A couple of things. Data is definitely the top of my list, right? Like you don't know what your problem is if you can't quantify it. And I talk about this a lot, and sometimes lawyers roll their eyes and they're like, oh, but we can just does that need to be captured? Can't they just email us about that? I'm like, no, you really want that? Like, let's capture it so you know what to do with it. So data is always that's a way in. And I think that, when you're looking at different technology solutions, I'm always asking, okay, what's going to give you the most useful data the soonest? Right. And I know we're going to talk about RFPs and that, so I'll hold off there. But I think that's really okay, let's get some information so that you can make a decision about where you want to go. And coming into an organization, sometimes you have that information. Sometimes you have to literally go get a 4,000 line spreadsheet dump and go through that line by line to be like, oh, this is what your outside counsel spend might have been. Let's try and make that better. So there are different ways in, but I think that it's really about, let's get some data and make those data-driven decisions. I know we hear this a lot in legal ops, data-driven decisions, but it is important because if you just start doing things and making changes, you may be solving for something that is maybe low-hanging fruit, but also you're not getting any return on investment, right?
Sure.
So it's where's the biggest bang for your buck? But also let's try to figure out what the biggest problems are.
As you think about solving those sorts of problems, was there an inflection point, because you're an EA and then you're sort of transitioning into taking on more of these projects that are ops related and solving problems for the GC? Was there an inflection point where you decided, I can't just brute force this, I need to leverage technology?
Absolutely. There was a desire to reduce outside counsel spend. From the main corporation in the UK saying, okay, Lloyd's America, you're spending too much money on outside counsel. So I was asked to look into that, see if we could figure out if we were spending too much money or give some data to back up what we were actually spending. And so my first response was, but why are we doing all of this manually? Right? Literally printing out PDFs of invoices for signature, putting it in an inter-office mail envelope, and sending it across the ocean to get paid.
Wow.
Literally. And then just hoping it gets paid. No visibility of when it would be. Or
it was like a mailroom. That's amazing, actually, in a sense.
Literally. And I knew that there was tech that could do this, even from my experience in the restaurant industry. This is pretty straightforward. So I was a little shocked that the legal profession was so far behind. So that was really, I was like, okay, so can we look at tech options? And the GC was like, oh, yeah, of course. Let's do that. We trialed one e-billing software for, I think, 6 months, maybe a little longer. And it wasn't perfect, but it was enough that everybody loved the concept and the data that we were getting. And so we then just engaged consultants to do an RFP for e-billing. And that exposed me to a lot of other solutions and really allowed us to make the correct choice for Lloyd's rather than just buying something and implementing it.
Sure.
So it was, that inflection point was, okay, you want me to solve for this, but there's just paper. It's just paper. And that was also the case at the law firm I went to, Sabin, Brabant & Gould, which is now part of Advance Publications. They were completely on paper. And so it was making that transition. There's so much efficiency to be gotten or to be gained by doing e-billing. It's really it's kind of shocking that it's taken the legal industry so long.
You talk about running these RFPs. Obviously, we participate in a lot of RFPs. From the in-house perspective, from your side, how do you think about running an effective RFP process? What are the tips that you have for others, or where are places where you think that folks often make mistakes that they could sort of easily solve?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had the answer. There isn't. There are a lot of resources though. There are a lot of resources from our trade groups and Clock that you can look at about RFPs. But in my personal experience, it's really about very clearly defining your needs, your pain points, setting those objectives, like what you want to solve for, and getting the right people involved. And, this is kind of that first step when you're doing an RFP. But again, in my experience, if you don't have all three of those things, if you don't know what the pain points are, if you don't know what you're solving for, and you don't have the right people involved, then it's not going to go anywhere, right? You could go all the way through an RFP, and then some stakeholder could be like, "Oh, but I don't want that."
Right.
Or you could be like, go through and you think, okay, I think I know where the pain points are in the process. And then you're looking at solutions, and then you find out, oh, it's actually not with legal that's the pain point here. It's with the business signing the contract, right? So do your due diligence before you start the RFP, I guess is kind of how I would distill that. Because if you do that, then you're set up for the rest of the RFP. You're set up for success. There's a lot more involved in that first step, of course, but you have to start strong, or you can lose your way in all the requirements and the demos and the evaluation criteria and all of that. It can get overwhelming. But if you have a really clear vision from that beginning of what you're trying to accomplish, I think that the RFP kind of flows a lot more naturally.
And what are the stakeholders that you have found are really important to be a part of either that pre-development process for the RFP, or actually when you get in there and start demoing tech solutions? Like, who should be in the room with you?
As many lawyers as you can get. Like, hopefully the whole team, or at least a delegate from each region or country. And that's what we did at Campari. We had a legal ops working group that was a global representation. So obviously the legal team, but then it's finance and IT, right? IT are your best partners. We know this, especially when you're doing technology, and often they own the budget for the technology. So it's good to get in with them on the ground floor. And if you're doing an e-billing, something with finance, to make sure that you actually can get some information on what the spend is, and not just on outside counsel spend, but actual, like, some insight into the finances of legal at a company. So I think those are my key people. Obviously the GC or the CO or the CLO are your primary stakeholder, but after the legal team, definitely finance and IT. Procurement, depending on if your organization has procurement, obviously they will be stakeholders, but that kind of just depends on individual needs.
I found this too in my career, which is sometimes, the right sort of next opportunity comes along organically. Sometimes you have to reach for it a little bit and get yourself to the next step. And I think that when you left Lloyd's, it might have been a little bit more of the latter. What did you end up doing afterwards? And also sort of, tucked in that is a question about, how do you know when it's the right time for you to go and pursue something new actively in legal ops?
Yeah, great question. There's no magic answer. For me, it's been all about timing and opportunity. When I left Lloyd's, it was because the vendor of the e-billing platform asked me if I'd be interested in implementing it somewhere else, because I was so good with the platform. They're like, well, we could hire you to come work for us, or you can go work for a client and save us from, So I was like, okay, great. And there's always the dollar figure, So if the dollar figure is bigger, then so I did that, and I rode that role through, that change actually ended up being 4 different roles at one company over time. So I went to the law firm, then I went to consulting. And that was my choice, because I just wasn't, at that time, I was still trying to perform. And so I couldn't be locked down to an office 4 to 5 days a week. They were a little flexible, but I was like, listen, this is life, and I want to do the things that make me happy. I like the job, but I want to have some flexibility. So I moved to a consulting remote position with them. And then when they changed their corporate structure, they called me and they're like, would you come back? And I said, sure, this time is great. Let's do it. So even within a company, there are opportunities for change. But if it's not working, you can also say, hey, I want to continue to help you, but I want to change the nature of our relationship. So I think that that's something I've heard from a lot of colleagues, is like, they feel like they're stuck with the job they were hired for, and you don't have to be. Like we're all replaceable, but we're also all valuable in one way or another. So you can say, okay, I want to step back and focus on just this part, maybe have a little more freedom. You call me when you want more. And then, so it's just in being open to opportunity, really. That's for me. It's like, okay, if something comes along and there's a chance, I'll at least have the conversation.
I have a follow-up there actually for you, because I think you're right. I do think that sometimes people in legal ops they get bored, or they feel like they get pigeonholed, especially in one subject matter area. So maybe they're like the e-billing person, or they're the CLM person, or what have you. Do you have advice for folks who may be very, very good at, and by the way, this also I think happens around paralegals as well, which is a whole other, right? Like, they're the litigation person, and do you have advice for folks who maybe want to move into a slightly more generalist legal ops role, or maybe even just want to try, it could be specific, but want to try something new because they think that if they get experience here and experience here and experience here, then they might be able to jump to something more generalist?
Yeah, you're right. I do see that happening a lot, where people get pigeonholed and feel like they're stuck. I think that you have to be willing to change is the first thing, right? So that's a starting point. But then you have to okay, so how do I make this change? For me, it was really about building relationships with vendors and other legal ops professionals. So even after I wasn't working with those vendors, I would still stay in touch with the implementation manager. And that person is now 4 jobs later at a much bigger company, so it's those relationships, as with all industries, those relationships are very important, but not with just the vendors, but also with your peers. And when I started, there wasn't a lot of possibility for legal ops professionals to engage. Now we have Clock, we have legal operators, we have a lot more opportunity. So I encourage everyone, attend those webinars, go to those conferences, ask questions, and really anything that intrigues you or interests you, dive into it. This could be a change. And to your point about paralegal, that's when I was at Lloyd's, that was my second title, was paralegal. So just because you're called a paralegal, I mean, that's a very vague job description as it is, we all know, doesn't mean that you have to stick with that. So it's just look for an opportunity, really. And if you are stuck in a position, because take e-billing, for example, where you're literally just stuck processing invoices, make a pitch hey, we could outsource this, or we could put in some more rules, or now we could put in some AI that could save you 20 hours a week so that I can do more for you as your employer. So don't feel stuck. Just don't. There's always a way out. I know that it's a fraught world right now, and we all want to stay employed. But I think if you make that positive effort, it will be seen by your bosses, by your colleagues, and you never know what will happen.
It's like a mix of initiative, and then also I think something that you seem to have in spades, which is curiosity. And I don't know. I mean, I think that curiosity is really important. I think that it's something that people should embrace. I think that's where a lot of insight comes from, because one may end up seeing parallels that they otherwise wouldn't, because they learned something that wasn't directly applicable to their day to day. I'm curious how you think about curiosity in your work, and how you try to cultivate that, because legal ops is a lot of process too.
I mean, I've said this before, of curiosity is why I'm in legal ops. It was never it wasn't a career when I started it. It didn't exist. And so it was just I see that literally leads data files, like a legal invoice. I was there is so much data to be gained out of this text file. There's just a lot of opportunity. So it's kind of chasing down that curiosity and being open to it. Yeah. I mean, I'm constantly looking at new pieces of technology, new things, even if they're not applicable to my current job. I'll still walk by a vendor's booth and be okay, give me your pitch. Don't be afraid to hear a pitch. You're not obligated to call them back.
We won't be offended if you.
Exactly. So it's really good to just keep an open mind, and don't be afraid to embrace change.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you need to be in there, because you are very curious about technology, right? And it seems like you demo everything that's in the market. You really understand it. You know how the pipes fit together, or how the different tech solutions fit together, what the integrations look like. Do you think you really need to be at that level to be able to run a legal ops organization? Is it possible to be sort of more strategic and not be a little bit in the weeds on the tech? Or is this really ultimately a job where the tech is just so important that that's where you need to live?
I'm not of the opinion that you have to know the tech. to have a career in legal ops. For me, that was my way in, right? That because I like technology in general and learning these applications and software, but by no means is that the only skill that I've had to improve. So no, I don't think you have to be, I call myself an accidental technologist, right? Because it just happened. But you don't have to be that person who is literally administrating a database or configuring it. You can be the person who's guiding that, relying upon your partners in the business and with your vendors to accomplish the vision of your GC. So no, I don't think that you have to be, tech is a shiny new toy, right? So that's it's appealing to me, but it's really about, okay, so beyond that one piece of technology, what can we explore, how we can connect that with what we already have, or what would this bring us down in the future? Like, are there new synergies and integration opportunities, or are we okay with how things are going? We really just want to quantify it, and then that's a different kind of tech. But you don't have to be the one running the technology by any means. I've seen, I think I'm an outlier in that I'm very much hands-on. A lot of employers see that as a benefit, which is great, but by no means is it a requirement. Like if you have project management skills, then you're already in legal ops. And even if you're not calling yourself that, because that's also a big part of it. It's managing the RFPs that we talked about earlier, changing processes, documenting that. So you can really kind of lean into whatever your skill set is, and then it's how you portray yourself to others, right? So I started using the term legal operations consultant back in 2015. Right? And I was like, I don't think that this is a thing, but I'm going to make it the thing because this is
One of the things that I was really curious to ask you about is you've not only seen implementations go right, but since you've seen a lot of implementations, you've also seen when implementations go wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, one, are there things you can do to not get to that point? But two, I mean, part of this is that, doing tech implementations is actually hard. And I'm curious advice that you have for how folks can work best with vendors, and also how vendors can work well with legal ops professionals to try to solve when things go wrong.
Yes, absolutely. I would say at kind of the highest level, don't wed yourself to one piece of technology and think that this implementation is going to be the be all end all. There may be different tech coming. It might not work for you. Even if you get all the way through an implementation, there might be something that makes it so it's not adopted, whether that's internally or by the business. So that's kind of at a high level is don't think that you've failed because an implementation has gone wrong. You haven't. It's just a piece of software. But where I've seen it go wrong, and what I would caution everyone is try not to be too reliant on implementation consulting vendors. There are a lot of these out there, right, who say, hey, we'll come in and we'll implement your DM, we'll implement your CLM, you rely on us. My experience with that is it doesn't work. And I'm being very blunt, but because it is my experience where we literally, if that implementation consultant, if someone gets a new job at that company and they were working on your implementation and they leave, it's not like anyone else at that consultant can pick up that work. They've taken that knowledge with them. And even if they document everything, like you'll find out later that they were doing things that, we never would have done this way, right? But because they were only thinking of it in the short term, like of one module, say a CLM. So when we got to the ELM, all of the default fields had already been used up for the CLM. So we then had to go back and re-implement. So I would say take more ownership of the implementation internally and with the vendor. You can have an implementation consultant, but don't be completely hands off. Don't let them run it because it's yours. Like it's your product that you need to work at the end. So don't be completely reliant upon them. The vendors can sometimes step in and help you with. I've had that happen where we were like, hey, we're not happy with this consultant. We don't want to move forward with this software unless you, the vendor, are helping us implement it. You kind of have that power as the customer. And they're usually willing to do that. It might take a little longer, but you're getting a better result. So that's part of making sure that a vendor is willing to grow and change with you And so that's something that I've started to put in an RFP is like, okay, right, like this is what we think we're going to do, but if something goes wrong, are you, the vendor, going to pick up the pieces and help us get to the finish line? So I think that's important. Don't, like, consultants are great, but don't be completely reliant upon them.
Almost think of them as sort of like fractional, like they're a complement to maybe an internal resource that you have. So that way your internal resource doesn't have to be 100% focused on this implementation. Instead, they can be 15 or 20% focused on the implementation.
Exactly. Yeah. And on the other side, sometimes it's an internal issue, right? That causes an implementation to not succeed. And those are a little harder to know until you have a product and then you see if people are actually using it. But so sometimes you just need to, like, as you're going through, especially when you get to like the beta testing, really take that opportunity or doing some kind of testing before you go live, because that's your opportunity to fix it or to step back and say, hey, maybe we're trying to be too ambitious. Let's do a little more due diligence, do a little more work and make this better. But so yeah, I think that part of the role in legal ops is being in between the vendor, the consultant, and your internal team, and making sure that it doesn't go off of the rails.
Yeah. The second part of that question was about what vendors can do. And I want to hear from you what vendors can do to make implementations go well, or how you've seen vendors respond positively. Like when you've been happy with the response when things are going wrong. Like, I'll give you an example that I heard from someone once, which was, they got rid of a CLM because utilization was super, super, super low. And that didn't come up as a discussion point until the contract was up for renewal. And like the GC hadn't really been paying attention to it and assumed that it was and then, right, like utilization was basically nothing. And when they went back to the CLM provider, they were like, well, I'm not going to renew with you if you haven't been a partner with me for the last 2 years and come to me and said, actually, it looks like something might be wrong internally. Why is no one using this? So it's just an example that I heard from someone one time that I thought was good and that stuck in my head of like, vendors need to really be partners too. How do you think vendors can be partners, just generally speaking, but also especially when things are going wrong?
I think they need to be proactive. And what I see from vendors is that they're very reactive, which is also a problem in the legal profession in general. But if you're the vendor for a piece of software and you know that in 6 months there's going to be a major change that would affect how your customer would use it, I feel like you're obligated to share that information. And I know sometimes they can't because there's no guarantees, but I have worked with, so in the context of CLM, the last one I worked with, they were really great about that, where we would be implementing and be like, okay, but I know my GC is going to hate this. So how can we get around this particular issue? And they'd be like, well, it's not official, but in 2 months, we're having a release where you'll be able to fix it. I'm like, okay, great. Then that's all I needed to know. I won't even mention it to my GC until 2 months from now.
Right. Yep.
And so in there, and depending on the size of the organization, they're sometimes more willing to share that information. If it's a startup, they're generally like, yes, let's do it. We'll work with you. If it's a bigger enterprise thing, you might not have as much luck, but that's also really, are they fulfilling the scheduled work, right? Are they actually giving you what you paid for? So being specific in that, and if you have a hunch that an implementation is going to take longer than they say it is, put that in the contract. It
happens that you got about 18 months ago or so, got a call out of the blue from Campari and joined to build their legal ops program. And this is, I think, the first time maybe that you've done this from scratch. There wasn't much there before you stepped in. How is doing it from scratch different than the experiences that you've had before? What have you had to draw on to succeed in this environment?
I would say, so I think all of my positions, we've really been starting from zero as far as technology, but not starting from zero as far as process and procedure. So I think that was the difference at Campari, is that there was fractured process globally, and for good reason, right? Some of it was different regulatory requirements. Some of it is sheer volume. So it's always a little different of figuring out where the best place to start, right? We look at the clock core 12, right? We all reference this, the core 12 competencies. And so when I went to Campari, I was like, all right, which half of this do you want to focus on first? Like where where are the pain points? Because you can't do everything all at once. It's too much. And so it was really just listening, like, oh, okay. So despite like what I would call best practice, generally implementing a CLM first is not a great idea because the data it's just different. And then if you're trying to implement with other things later, you run into problems. But if you're hemorrhaging money from contracts, then yeah, let's get a CLM in place. Even if it's not the one you're using 3 years from now, get something so you can at least track obligations. And, sometimes there's a disconnect where the policy at a company can be the business is responsible for tracking obligations of the contracts. But then there's no mechanism for them to do that. So that means each department is supposed to keep a spreadsheet and just know when a contract is up for renewal or expiration. I think everybody who's listening to this probably knows that's not going to happen. So if you don't give them a tool to be able to track dates even, then just saying that it's the business's fault makes legal look worse. So it's okay, so let's get business involved in this CLM implementation, make sure that they can use it. They'll get notifications about the deadlines, and this stops being an issue, right? Because nobody can say, I didn't know. And even if you have high turnover and the people leave, there's still now a data trail, or an audit trail is a better way to say it. And so at each organization, where you start is not going to be the same. You can look at the Clock Core 12, see where, but really, I think in what I've seen in all three is where are we losing money the most, right?
Yeah.
And it's business, right? You want to, the less money you lose, the more money we make. And that gives you more clout to be able to then say, okay, we did this. Let's now buy more technology. Let's do other things.
Sure.
So it's what can you solve? Maybe not necessarily the quickest, but the most effectively is the way I would put it.
As we were talking about your experience in Campari before this, one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you said was that you're using technology to drive process. And I think that I often say, and this is more just a lesson that I've learned from lots of other people in legal ops, is you want to have process and policy in addition to technology. In other words, technology can't be the silver bullet. Yeah. So square that circle for me. Yeah. Help me understand how you use tech to drive process as opposed to the two sort of working in concert.
Absolutely. So I agree. Ideally, the process would be driving the tech, but the world is not ideal. So at Campari, we, in particular, they have a very aggressive growth agenda. And so they want to be making more money more quickly. And so it's okay, when we look at what is documented for the global process for contracts, for example, I'm oh, great. You have a global process, a global contracting handbook. Awesome. You have a process in place. This is great. And then 3 months later, you find out, oh, the only people actually using this are in one region. And everybody else is still doing what they were always doing. And this was pushed out by someone who didn't really get the buy-in from the whole global organization. So but you've already published this to the business, right? You've already told the business that this is how it's going to work. So the challenge there is okay, well, are we sticking with that? And if so, how do we make it work for legal, since legal has different processes?
Yep.
So that was really kind of the strategy is okay, let's keep the global process for the business. They don't need to know that anything's different in the background. They don't need to look under the hood of the technology, but we can force our legal team to be more diligent and follow the steps and take a little more ownership of it. And then that's how we use the tech to really drive the process. The process is the same. The way each region or country does it can be accommodated by the technology. So it's, as long as you're getting to the same end goal, it's sometimes easier rather than spending months and months and months okay, how can we all get on one process? If it's clear that, it might be impossible. It might literally be impossible because especially with a global organization, you can't do everything the same way, but you can get really close. And if you have the technology allowing or enabling the lawyers to move forward with that, then it becomes much less of an issue that there's not a unified process because the end result is the same, right?
I really like that. And brings to mind for me a theme that I talked a lot about with Susan Packle, who runs legal ops for Atlassian, on an episode I did with her that came out a couple weeks ago. We spent the time talking about her different experiences across Hilton and Twilio and Atlassian. She's been other places too, great companies, but how context drives the right approach to legal operations. In other words, it's not like there's, just like this list of best practices and all programs need to be done in this way. And if you just go and benchmark against all your peers, you'll find the right answer. No, the way that she does legal operations at Atlassian is radically different than the way that she did legal operations at Twilio and who she hires, et cetera. Curious if you feel like, given your experiences at these very different organizations, you feel the same way.
Absolutely. There is no one size fits all. You kind of, to go back to the core 12 again, it's like sometimes you literally just spin that wheel and be like, okay, is this something like, okay, this triangle, okay, we can solve this. And for this company, maybe these 3 triangles are where we start. But it is different. And if you try to do things the same at a new organization as you did at the last, you'll just get resistance from the GC, but also it's not really the best way to go about it. You need to really understand the organization. And I think in my first pitch that I made to the global team, there was a question of what is legal ops? And my answer is it's whatever you need it to be. Like whatever you, the company, need legal operations to be for you in this moment as we're starting it, then that's what it's going to be. I think that sounds maybe a little simplistic, but it's true.
That's great. That's really great. This has been such a practical conversation, Cory. I love this. I've got a couple of hopefully fun questions for you as we start to wrap up that I like to ask pretty much all of our guests. The first is, I'm a big reader, and I wonder if there's a book that you've read that's been very influential in your career, or you've just read recently and thought has been really good, that you'd like to share with our audience.
Influential in my career. I'd have to think about that for a minute, but I'll tell you what I'm currently reading. I just finished a really good historical fiction novel by Madeline Miller called The Song of Achilles. And it's 3 years old. Yeah, it was won a few awards, really good book. And then what I'm in the middle of now is I'm a science fiction nerd at heart.
Okay.
The love for technology, that might not be a surprise. But I'm reading Three Body Problem, which is by Lu Shizhen. It was made into a new Netflix series recently.
Yes, it's like set in China, or I've read about this. Yeah,
and this book was only translated into English, I think, in 2019, but it's been around since 2006. So this is something that I've been a story that I've been hearing about for a long time, but haven't really even been able to dive into it. And it's just really nice to read, to have science fiction from a non-American point of view, but it's also very gripping. It's a really cool book. I like, as I mentioned, Song of Achilles is great for some historical fiction. In my career, I read a lot. I don't know that I would say there's one tone. I do read the legal ops books as well. And I'm blanking on names at the moment, but there are some great ones out there. I'm going to pull it up on my iBooks and see what that title is.
That's all right. You can send us one or two, and we can put them in the show notes. Great. If folks want to read a legal ops related title.
Great, I'll do that.
My last question for you is, as we wrap up, is if you could look back when you were just getting started in legal ops, maybe not knowing that legal ops was going to be, 15 years of your career. Yeah. Something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
I alluded to it earlier of making friends with finance and IT, specifically and especially IT. And when I started actually at Saban, Vermont Gold, my second legal ops career, I was reporting out of IT. So that was when they were like, oh, we know it's legal, but it's like technology. So where does it fit? And so that was great. And then building that relationship with finance, because they're also wary. They're just as wary of this technology as legal is. Whereas IT is like, why haven't you done this yet? So it's about, okay, finance, we're going to give you whatever you need as well. This is not just for what legal needs, but it's really building a relationship. I think that, IT have always been my biggest champions at my jobs, because they see, oh, this is somebody who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to the technology. So there's just some trust that you really get out of the box there. Do I know how to code? No. Can I, if I need to? Yes. Like if I need to tweak something in a software, yes. But it's good to have those partners. And the other thing, especially at the last few positions, I would say don't be afraid to be the bad guy sometimes. It's more dangerous in my opinion, to be a yes man than it is to just say no sometimes. But make sure you can back up that no with something, whether it's data or best practices, or it's a yes, but not now. That's also a no. You have to take that into account. And sometimes it's not only what's best for legal, but what's best for the organization in the longer term planning. It's also what's best for you, right? As a legal ops professional. So especially if you're like a department of one, which I have been before, you have to be practical and say okay, I can accomplish these things for you, but I can't accomplish all of them right now without resources. So what do you want to do first? Let's be very pragmatic and be like, this is reachable within this year or this quarter. And just make sure that your opinion is valued. I think that's, for a while I was like, okay, I just have to do what the GC says. There is something to that, but keep in mind that they're not legal operations, right? That's why they hired you. So tell them what you feel, not just what they want to hear.
What a great place to leave this conversation. This has been really great, Cory. Thank you so much for joining this episode of The Abstract.
Thank you, Tyler. It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.
If you like this one, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a rating or a comment. See you all next week.